Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. Last week, what was supposed to be a routine budget hearing on Capitol Hill didn't feel routine at all. It didn't even feel like a policy discussion. It felt like a confrontation not just between lawmakers and the Pentagon, but between two completely different ways of seeing the world. Defense officials, led by Pete Hegseth, walked into Congress expecting to defend numbers, funding levels, projections, operational needs. Instead, almost immediately, the hearing turned into something much bigger. Lawmakers weren't just asking about budgets. They were asking about the war itself, the war with Iran, and whether it should be happening at all. The tone shifted fast. Within minutes, members of Congress began pressing for answers that went far beyond line items and appropriations. Why are we in this conflict? What exactly is the mission? How long is it expected to last? And perhaps most importantly, what is the strategy for ending it? According to Pentagon officials, the war has already cost tens of billions of dollars. Some estimates suggest that the daily cost alone has reached extraordinary levels, placing additional strain on an already complex economic environment. And despite that, the administration is now seeking a significant increase in funding, potentially hundreds of billions more to sustain and expand operations. That alone would have been enough to generate intense scrutiny, but the financial cost was only one part of the controversy. Lawmakers raised concerns about civilian casualties, citing reports that strikes had hit not only military targets, but also areas where civilians were present, including schools and medical facilities. Questions were also raised about internal decisions within the military, including the removal or reassignment of senior officers. Some members of Congress expressed unease about the pace and transparency of those decisions, particularly when they appeared to affect experienced leadership during an ongoing conflict. And then there was the question that seemed to sit underneath everything else: legitimacy. Several lawmakers argued that the war lacked clear authorization in a way that reflects the will of the American people. They pointed out that public support appears divided and, in some cases, declining. They spoke about what they were hearing back home, not from policy experts or think tanks, but from ordinary people dealing with rising fuel prices, higher grocery bills, and a growing sense that they are once again being pulled into a costly overseas conflict. For those lawmakers, the issue wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal for their constituents. The war wasn't an abstract geopolitical event, it was something that showed up every time they filled up their cars, every time they went to the store, every time they looked at their household budgets. The response from the administration was firm and unapologetic. Officials argued that the threat posed by Iran is real, long-standing, and cannot be ignored. They pointed to decades of hostility, to Iran's role in regional conflicts, and to the possibility that it could eventually develop nuclear capabilities. In their view, the risks of inaction are just as serious, if not more so, than the risks of engagement. They pushed back against the idea that the war is unnecessary or premature. They framed it as a proactive measure, a way to confront a growing threat before it becomes unmanageable. Waiting, they argued, could lead to a far more dangerous situation down the line. And so the hearing unfolded as a clash of perspectives. On one side, lawmakers warning about cost, legitimacy, and the potential for another prolonged conflict. On the other, officials emphasizing threat, deterrence, and the dangers of waiting too long. What was striking wasn't just the disagreement, it was how fundamental that disagreement was. Because beneath the policy arguments, beneath the statistics and projections, there was a deeper question that never quite went away. Is this war actually necessary? Not in a general sense, not as an abstract idea. But right now, under current conditions, with the information that's available, is this conflict the only or even the best way to address the challenges posed by Iran? It's a question that doesn't have an easy answer, and it's a question that carries a lot of weight because history has shown how costly it can be to get it wrong. The United States has spent decades engaged in conflicts across the Middle East. Some began with clear objectives and strong public support. Over time, many became more complicated, more expensive, and more difficult to conclude. The Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan are often cited as examples not simply because of their scale, but because of how they evolved. In both cases, initial expectations did not fully align with long-term realities. Costs grew, timelines extended, objectives shifted. And eventually, the question of necessity, the question of whether the outcomes justified the sacrifices, became a central part of the national conversation. That historical memory matters. It shapes how people interpret current events. It influences how lawmakers approach decisions. And it adds a layer of caution to any discussion about entering or expanding a conflict. So when members of Congress raise concerns about the trajectory of the war with Iran, they're not just reacting to what's happening now, they're also reacting to what has happened before. At the same time, those advocating for a more assertive approach are also drawing from history, but a different lesson. From their perspective, waiting too long to address a growing threat can make future conflicts more difficult and more dangerous. Allowing an adversary to gain strength, to expand its capabilities, or to shift the balance of power in a critical region can create conditions that are far harder to manage later. This is especially true when the issue of nuclear capability is involved. Even the possibility that a state could develop such capabilities changes the strategic landscape in profound ways. It affects not just military planning, but diplomatic leverage, regional alliances, and global stability. And so, the debate isn't simply about whether Iran is a threat. It's about timing, it's about strategy, it's about how to weigh immediate costs against potential future risks. On one hand, there is no widely accepted evidence, at least publicly, that an attack on the United States was imminent. There is no clear indication that a specific, irreversible event was about to occur in the immediate future. That matters, because urgency is often what defines necessity. On the other hand, the risks associated with a more powerful or more capable Iran are not hypothetical. They are part of long-standing strategic concerns that have shaped U.S. policy in the region for years. So, the decision facing policymakers isn't a simple binary choice. It's a complex calculation involving uncertainty, competing risks, and incomplete information. Act now and risk becoming entangled in a prolonged conflict with uncertain outcomes. Hold back and risk facing a potentially more dangerous situation later. But beyond the strategic calculations, there is another dimension that often receives less attention: the domestic impact. Wars are not only fought on battlefields, they have consequences at home. They influence economic conditions, they shape political discourse, they affect public trust in institutions. And over time, they can alter the relationship between the government and the people it serves. The hearing on Capitol Hill made that clear. This wasn't just a debate about foreign policy. It was a reflection of broader tensions between different branches of government, between different political parties, and between different segments of the population. Some lawmakers emphasized the burden placed on ordinary Americans: rising costs, economic uncertainty, and the sense that decisions are being made without sufficient public input. Others emphasized the responsibility of leadership, the need to act decisively in the face of potential threats, even when those decisions are difficult or unpopular. And in between those positions lies a space filled with questions. Questions about transparency, questions about accountability, questions about long-term strategy, questions that don't have immediate answers. Which brings us back to the central issue. Is this war necessary? Based on the information available, the answer isn't straightforward. There is no clear consensus that the threat is imminent in a way that makes immediate military action unavoidable. There is no definitive evidence that all other options have been exhausted. And there is already a visible and growing cost associated with the conflict. At the same time, there are legitimate concerns about what could happen if the situation is allowed to evolve without intervention. There are risks associated with inaction, just as there are risks associated with action. So perhaps the most accurate way to understand the situation is this. This is not a war whose necessity is universally accepted. It is a war whose necessity is being actively debated. And that distinction matters. Because when a war is clearly necessary, the debate tends to be limited. The focus shifts quickly to execution, to strategy, to achieving objectives. But when the necessity itself is in question, the debate becomes broader. It becomes more intense. It becomes more political. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. The hearing wasn't just about policy. It was about perspective. It revealed a fundamental divide not just between political parties, but between different interpretations of risk, responsibility, and national interest. Some see the war as a necessary step to prevent a larger crisis. Others see it as a potentially avoidable conflict that could create new problems without fully resolving existing ones. And many are still trying to figure out where they stand. What is clear is that this is a moment of uncertainty, a moment where decisions are being made without complete clarity about their long-term consequences, a moment where the line between proactive strategy and reactive escalation is not always easy to define, and a moment where the stakes both abroad and at home are significant. So, instead of offering a simple answer, perhaps the more useful approach is to recognize the complexity, to understand that necessity is not always obvious, to acknowledge that different perspectives can be grounded in legitimate concerns, and to continue asking the question, not once, but repeatedly, is this war making the United States safer? Or is it introducing new risks that may be difficult to control? That question doesn't end with a single hearing. It doesn't end with a single decision. It continues as long as the conflict continues. And how it is answered through outcomes, through consequences, through lived experience will shape not just this moment, but the broader direction of U.S. policy in the years ahead. Thanks for watching.